Begin first with vulnerability. Vulnerability is defined as a condition resulting from physical, social, economical, and environmental factors or processes, which increases the susceptibility of a community to the impact of hazard. On the other hand, we can also say that vulnerability is the state or the status of the different risk factors that we have discussed. We should also consider the following by means of identifying the vulnerability of that particular area. First one is regarding with infrastructure. Do the infrastructure of that particular area are sound and safe? Okay. Number two is the economic power of that country. Do this country are have the economic power to produce, to have relief operation, and of course, to overcome and to recover from this disaster. Number three is the manpower, the number of people that will be involved in relief operation, and of course, to the recovery of that nation. Number four is to the type of population that they have. How many people are part of elderly? How many people are women? How many people are part of the children? And of course, PWD. And lastly is about the government itself. How do the government prepare for the different types of hazards that presented on their location or their area? And of course, education. Okay? Do the people of this country are highly aware about the different hazards that are presented on their area? So these are the consideration in identifying the vulnerability of that area. Now, let's talk about the four main types of vulnerability. First one is the physical vulnerability, which includes the infrastructure and of course the population. I have here some example. First example, wooden homes are less likely to collapse in an earthquake but are more vulnerable to fire. As we can see here, in physical vulnerability, we identify what is the impact of the infrastructure to the particular hazard. As you can see to the example presented, we have here the hazard earthquake and of course the hazard fire. In earthquake, wooden homes that are made from woods and of course from different lighter materials can be less vulnerable to earthquake or by means of the shaking of the grounds. While for fire, wooden homes and lighter materials that are made from those materials are more vulnerable to fire. So this category includes or part of physical vulnerability. The second vulnerability is the social vulnerability. This one refers to the inability of people, organization, and society to withstand adverse impacts to hazards due to characteristics inherent in social interaction, institution, and system of cultural values. We can also include in social vulnerability the knowledge, the awareness level of the population by means of the different hazards presented. Example, when flooding occurs, some citizens, such as children, elderly, and differently able, may be unable to protect themselves or evacuate if necessary by looking at the physiological property of those population. Of course, children and elderly and differently able population are more vulnerable to this kind of hazard because if you will look to their physiological properties or to their bodies. At the same time, by means of the knowledge or to the level of awareness that they have. Third vulnerability is the economic vulnerability or the socio-economic factor of the population. This includes the manpower, also the wealth, the resources of that particular area or to that particular country. Example, poorer people or families may live in squatter settlements because they cannot afford to live in safer or more expensive areas. That's why during disaster, poorer families are more prone or more vulnerable because their location, the location of their homes are in not safer environment. And this will contribute to higher impact of disaster. Fourth vulnerability is the environmental vulnerability. Natural resources depletion and resource degradation are key aspects of this environmental vulnerability. Example, wetlands are sensitive to increasing salinity from seawater and pollution from stormwater runoff containing agricultural chemicals, eroded soils, and etc. On the other hand, pag sinabi natin environmental vulnerability, yung environment ba na kinabibilangan ng particular na area na ito ay maaaring mag-contribute doon sa hazard or doon sa disaster na maaaring na-experience ng particular na population na iyon. Now, let's talk about regarding with exposure. Exposure refers to which is affected by natural disaster such as people and property. In simplest meaning, pag sinabi natin exposure, sino nga ba at ano nga ba yung maaaring maging victim ng particular na disaster or ng hazard na ito? Example, okay? People, property, system, and other elements, whether it is tangible or intangible by meaning. Okay? Second one is the located in identified hazard zone, and of course, the potential losses that we perceive on that particular area. So these three components defines what is the meaning of exposure, or sila yung maaaring maapektuhan or ano yung maging epekto ng particular na hazard doon sa isang aspect na yun. So how to reduce this exposure? First one is prevention, or these are the steps to eliminate that particular hazards. Paano nga ba natin maiiwasan itong mga hazards na ito? And what we need to do is to have prevention. Number 2 is mitigation. When we say mitigation, steps to reduce the hazards. Paano natin ito magagawang bawasan, okay, instead of maalis in prevention. And the number 3 is adaptation or to modification. How we will adapt to our environment, how we will adapt to this hazard to mitigate and of course to prevent this particular hazard and the impact of this hazard to the daily living of the people. What are now the relationship of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability to disaster risk? Here, the disaster risk model. Disaster risk model is the conceptual model that showcases the relationship of hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and disaster risk. Take note, okay? Take note that the disaster risk is at the central point of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability because this is our main goal to reduce disaster risk. Let us also give attention to the other concept on the model. Hazards, okay, which represents earthquakes, rain, storm, and other types of hazards, while exposure is the people, property, and other things that might be affected by an upcoming disaster. And vulnerability represents how prepared we are on the different hazards presented. Also, this disaster risk model are used to identify ano nga ba yung mga dapat gawin ng tao para ma-eliminate, para ma-reduce, at para maka-adapt sa mga iba't ibang klaseng hazards na presented tayo. Ito din yung ginagamit ng ibang experts para makagawa ng isang konkretong plano kung paano ang gagawin natin kapag nagkaroon na ng disaster. That's why disaster risk model is very important in planning on how we will have disaster risk management. And also, this model showcases the relationship of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Without these three concepts, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, you cannot have disaster risk itself because these three concepts are interrelated to each other to identify what are the cause and what are the result or the effect of that particular hazard to the people. So, why it is important to study about the disaster risk model? First one is to prepare for and to respond to disaster-related displacement. And number 2, to prevent future displacement and reduce its impact on people and community. And number 3 is to achieve durable peace, security, and global governance. When we say displacement, it means that the people affected by this particular disaster. And of course, by means of studying the disaster risk model, we will eliminate the people that will be affected by means of these hazards. Take note of this particular concept. First one, there is no such thing as natural disaster, only natural hazard. But because natural disaster is impossible to happen, remember that disaster can be prevented, can be mitigated, and of course, we can adapt on it. That's why there is no such thing as natural disaster, only natural hazard. Also, take note that we make choices as to where we inhabit, how we build, and what research we can do. Sabi nga natin kanina, pwede nating i-prevent, pwede nating i-mitigate, at pwede tayong mag-adapt. And this is also one of the options that we can do. Piliin natin mabuti. Saan nga ba tayo titira? At dito sa titirahan natin, safe ba dito? Wala ba ditong hazard na maaari nating ma-experience? Risk is the combination of hazard, exposure, and of course, vulnerability. Kung wala itong tatlo na ito, walang hazard, walang exposure, walang vulnerability, ibig sabihin, mababa yung tsansa na magkakaroon ng isang disaster. And lastly, death, loss, and damage is the function of the context of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Huwag nating intayin na magkaroon ng death, magkaroon ng loss and damage doon sa particular na aspect ng community natin. Tandaan natin, walang natural disaster. Natural hazard lang. At ito mga natural hazard na ito ay pwede nating i-prevent, pwede nating i-mitigate, at pwede tayong mag-adapt. Now, for the last topic for this video lesson, what are the different or who are the different sectors that are vulnerable in times of disaster? First one are the industrialized countries or the rich countries. Yes, rich countries are also vulnerable to different types of hazards. Why? Number 1, higher short-term economic losses. Because there are rich countries or industrial countries, number 1 impact to their country is the economic losses. Number 2, gender and age demography. Of course, in these industrial countries, gender-based discrimination and age-based discrimination are higher compared to the developing countries. Number 3, emergency preparedness. How they will utilize all the resources that they have to respond to a particular disasters that they have encountered. So, these are the following factors or problems that industrial countries can be experienced or vulnerable kapag dumating itong mga disaster na ito. Of course, infrastructural also. Okay, next one. Next one are the developing countries wherein Philippines are part of. So, why Philippines are vulnerable to disaster? Number 1, maaaring magkaroon ng long-term impact doon sa economy natin at saka sa social development ng isang lugar. Example, katulad ng nangyari sa Leyte at sa Samar during the Typhoon Yolanda. Until now, nakikita natin na hindi pa rin totally nakaka-recover yung buong probinsya to Super Typhoon Yolanda. At nakita natin yung long-term impact ng particular na hazard dun sa economy at social development ng area. Pangalawa, massive casualties. Maraming naapektuhan, maraming namamatay. Number 3, lack of resources by means of response and relief operations. And forced to divert funds. Since developing countries do not have lots of money to spend to their disaster operation, usually, ang ginagawa ng mga developing countries, dinadivert yung funds or kumukuha ng pondo sa ibang pondo na meron na. Kaya, yung ibang social services, nakakalimutan na natin. Kasi, kailangan natin i-prioritize. Ano ba yung mas kailangan? At doon nagkakaroon ng diversion of funds. And of course, lack of technological advancement. We do not have a total capacity to predict, to monitor this kind of hazards that we have experienced. Next one are the minority group or the ethnic group. They're vulnerable because their geographical location. Okay, because of their geographical location, slow down or slowing of relief operations might happen. Okay, and of course, their traditions, culture, and practices. Ano nga ba yung pagkakaunawa ng mga minority groups natin regarding with disaster preparedness and disaster risk management? At paano ba sila matuturuan pagdating sa mga konsepto na ito? Okay? Next one are the people in the poverty line. Yung mga mahihirap na tao at mahihirap na family. Okay, why they are vulnerable? Because of socioeconomic factors, diba? Instead of living to a safer home, usually napupunta sila dun sa mga home, sa mga area na mas delikado. Okay, number 2 also is education. The level of their awareness regarding with disaster management. Sino nga ba ang nagtuturo dito sa mga tao na ito pagdating sa disaster management? Okay, number 3 is food security. Okay, the safety of their food during disaster and after disaster, unsafe homes and location of settlement. The next one are the women. Women are more vulnerable in disaster. Why? Because they have less access of resources in some countries. We should take the fact that still, meron pa rin gender-based discrimination. And this gender-based discrimination has a great impact why women are vulnerable to disaster. Next one are children. Children are vulnerable because, number 1, because of their psychological and physiological factors. Tandaan natin, yung kanilang pangangatawan ay hindi pa equipped para maka-adjust doon sa disaster na kakaharapin natin. And of course, their psychological aspect, their mindset, their attitude towards what is happening to their community. Second is the ability or the probability of separation or loss of family. How these children will adjust kapag nawalan sila ng pamilya, kapag nahiwalay sila dun sa mga family members nila. The next one is, of course, the elderly people. Okay? Elderly people are vulnerable because, same with children, diba? There are also vulnerable by means of psychological and physiological factors by looking at to their body and, of course, to the mindset of those people, part of elder group. Okay? And neglected in policy making and programs. We should also take the fact that elderly people are usually neglected in policy making in the Congress and the Senate. Ano nga ba yung mga dapat na gawin kapag meron ng disaster dito sa mga elderlies natin? And of course, they are also has a higher chance of isolation from their families. Usually, elder people live alone. Kaya sila yung mas prone at mas vulnerable doon sa disaster. And of course, the people which is part of the PWDs or person with disability. They are also vulnerable because of physiological and psychological factors, also neglected in policymaking and programs, and discrimination. And of course, access to public services or to the different programs provided by the government. And our video lesson for this day, take note of this quotation. No one is immune in disaster. Everyone can become a victim. That's why prevention, mitigation, and adaptation is still the #1 solutions. That's why here in our Philippines, we always say, laging handa. Dapat maging laging handa tayo sa kung anumang sakuna ang maaaring dumating sa ating community. That's why it is very important to know about disaster reduction and risk management. This is the end of our video lesson. Once again, thank you for staying on our video lesson. See you to the next video lesson. Goodbye, class.